We're picking up in Daniel chapter 2, and Daniel has just received a night vision from the Lord and sees the king's dream. Nebuchadnezzar said, "You got to tell me the dream and the interpretation to all of his wise men." He said, "Or else you're all dead." And so Daniel asks prayer from his buddies, though they pray, and the Lord is merciful and gives them the answer. And so in chapter 2 and verse 31 through 35, Daniel actually gives the dream here, what it was, and says, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time, because like chaff from the summer threshing floors in the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So that's Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel gets the dream here. He's before Nebuchadnezzar. He tells him the whole dream. And then he goes into interpretation, and this goes on for much of the rest of the second chapter. Interesting here to me, one of the things that comes up here is he's giving the dream interpretation starting in verse 36, and then verse 37, he says, "You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the strength, and the glory." It's interesting here. This is the only, I think Nebuchadnezzar is the only one in the Bible other than Jesus called the King of Kings. Here he's referred to as the King of Kings. He's the kind of the beginning of the picture of the history of the earth and its dealings here that was revealed by God to him about the kingdoms that would come and the kingdoms that would go and the final kingdom that would take over. And so you see this in your Bible. It'll give a kind of a heading there. He's the first king, then Medo-Persia takes over, and then Greece takes over. And a lot of Bibles will head, the next one says Rome, and maybe it's Rome, maybe it's not. If it's Rome, I think it's at least Eastern Rome. There's some interesting things in here, because what happens here is then the divine kingdom comes in. It says in verse 44, "And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom," those kings being the kings of that fourth era, the fourth kingdom. "In the days of those kings," it says, "God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people, for it will crush and put an end to all those kingdoms, but it will in itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, and the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy." So here we see a stone cut out, and we know that there's references to Jesus as, that stone that the builders rejected. He's the chief cornerstone. This stone comes and crushes the foundation, the feet of this statue, and the whole thing collapses. That his kingdom is a kingdom that's set up forever. And now we see that this is introduced into the prophetic outlook, the future here, and of this coming kingdom that will finally reign, and these other kingdoms that will be there beforehand, but they'll be destroyed. They'll have a period when they'll reign, when they'll rule, but they'll finally be destroyed by this last kingdom that's the king that comes and stands. And we'll see in Daniel's visions that he gets a little more specific stuff about this one that would come and destroy these other kingdoms. We see over and over again this same kind of theme with these four kingdoms that are talked about in this dream. We see them repeated in sometimes very similar ways, sometimes other ways, and it seems to expand upon this same thing over and over and over again. It looks like God, when he's putting the scriptures together, the bringing into the culmination of history and the culmination of all the prophetic things that are spoken, this last period of time, which we'll get into more, the book of Daniel covers more and more, it goes over and over exposing that there'll be these kingdoms that come, there'll be these rulers that rise up. We'll see the introduction here of this specific ruler that becomes kind of the focus even in the New Testament of the man of sin, a man of lawlessness, the one we call the Antichrist. All this kind of stuff is introduced in this book of Daniel. And it starts with the introduction of these first kingdoms, and then it gets into a little more detail and it begins to sort it out a little more and get a little more specific. Well, without going into a lot of detail about this, if you want there's some good references out there. I'm going to recommend a guy right now on here, a guy named Joel Richardson, who does a really good job in Daniel dissecting all of this and giving you all the different options, and then kind of giving what he is leaning towards at this point. But I think that'd be good if you really want to study this, because I think a lot of these things will give us such insight. I think Daniel's book was written so that we could have insight, so that at the end of the age we can have confidence about what is going to take place, so that we can tell others and bring more into the kingdom. It kind of alludes to that as we get to the end of the book of Daniel, where it says, you'll have insight and understanding, and they'll lead many to righteousness. So I think it's important for us to understand this book in these days, I think the days that we're in, leading up to the end of the age, because it gets real specific, and we can know things and actually be able to give comfort to other people and saying, hey, this was expected, and this is, we should know this is coming, and here's the end of it. We can share what the prophetic end of that will be. Well, anyway, with all of that, and we get to verse 46 in chapter 2, it says, Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, did homage to Daniel, and gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These guys are hanging tight, and, a good group together, over the administration of the province of Babylon, while Daniel was at the king's court. So Daniel's buddies, Daniel gets the interpretation, but he doesn't leave his buddies out. I mean, they prayed for him. He mentions them to the king, and the king gives them they're over the whole province of Babylon, while Daniel's hanging out in the king's court at this point. So we see this first major dream interpretation that Daniel has, and it's amazing to me. I'm going to take a little side note here. It's amazing to me how often dreams are very pivotal in the revelation of God's will to people, and in the revealing of who God is to his people, revealing of information, all the way back to Jacob's dream when he saw the ladder whose feet were on earth and the head was in heaven, and he had that dream. And we see dreams throughout the scriptures, the Joseph of the Old Testament, the Joseph in the New Testament. All of those were dreamers and interpreters of dreams. And the interpretation of dreams becomes very important. And it's important in these days, because there's a whole culture of people out there in the Muslim world that put a lot of stock in dreams. And a lot of them, the Lord is reaching through dreams. And so if you've got some insight in that area, it's really helpful in these days. So we go on, chapter 3. You can edit this, right? I was looking at chapter 2. So in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar made a golden image. And he made it this really gigantic image, and he made it so everyone was supposed to worship this image. Well, we see of these three faithful friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they were going to refuse. They refused to fall down and worship. There was this whole setup, but it says, Therefore at the time, in verse 7, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music of all the peoples, nations and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image in Nebuchadnezzar that he had set up. But these three guys, these three friends of Daniel, they refused to do it. And so we see that we're going into one of the most famous stories in all of the Bible. It's used in references. People use it in allusions when they're talking about things, and it's in this whole thing of what happens when these three young men refuse to bow down and worship when the king commands that they do that.